Hello out there, everyone, and welcome to The Metagame here on the Dice Tower's YouTube channel. The live streaming show where we'll be talking not only about board games, but as always, also talking about board games. Now, I'm your host, complete with frog in my throat, Chaz Marler. Excuse me. And today we will be talking about the topic, board game, do as you will. Now, what's this topic going to be all about? Well, what this topic is about something that I run into every now and then, especially as a board game enthusiast and one who also enjoys tinkering with board game design as well. Lots of times, you will get a board game that you've been looking forward to for a long time, and you'll sit down and play it, and sometimes, pow, zing, it's everything you could have hoped for and more. Sometimes, as good as a game is, it just sometimes doesn't quite meet your expectations, keeps you pining for just a little bit more. Maybe you had a slightly different expectation for it. Maybe you just hope the game would have different mechanisms or some different surprises or even components. Now, one reason that I think that this is an important topic to discuss is because as someone who not only enjoys board games, but also goes through and discusses board games online, I have to keep in mind lots of times that it's important to keep that subjectivity at bay. When you talk about a board game in an online review or anything like that, lots of times I think it's important for that person to be able to draw a line between what they want a board game to be and what that board game itself wants to be. And if the person, there are times and places to talk about personal opinion, of course, but when talking and reviewing and demonstrating a game to the public, I think it's really important to let the game stand on its own and say, hey, this is what this game wants to be. Not necessarily what I was hoping it would be, and I can't tarnish this game's reputation just based on it not being what I want it to be. But that said, this is not a review. This is a discussion. So what I'm going to do is I have made a list here of several games that I've played that I failed at letting them be their own thing. These are games that didn't quite meet my expectations of what I wanted them to be and why, and what I wanted to see, how I've changed them with house rules, or even other things that we've done to them. And that's the basis of discussion. And so during, as I go along, I'm also going to be turning to the YouTube chat area. So I want to find out, what games have you played that you like the game, it's good enough, and you can understand what the game itself wants to be, but just doesn't quite fire on all cylinders for you. And maybe you have some house rules, maybe you added in a couple other things, maybe it's not quite what you expected. So what are some of those games that didn't meet all your expectations, surprised you in that way, and did you keep playing them or did you make changes to them, and what did you do? So that's the discussion for today. Also going to be listing some games that I think just nailed it. Nailed exactly what they wanted to be, and also nailed what I was hoping they would be. So that is today's discussion. And before we get started on today's discussion, I also wanted to do something special. I wanted to give a shout out to a few regular viewers who are local in my area. So if your name is Eric, Megan, Daniel, or Topher, who's not actually in my area, if you're watching, I've been paying attention to you guys watching, and I really appreciate it. And I also appreciate, of course, all the regular people whose names I'm starting to recognize in the chat area. I really appreciate your participation, and us working together is what makes this show really unique and special. So that's cool. Also cool, board games. So I have over here right next to me, you can't see it, it's off camera, but you can probably hear it. I have I have a teetering large pile of not whole games, but just the boxes of several games I'm going to be talking about. So I'll start pulling some games off of my pile here. I'm going to start with, since I've talked about it before, I think a game that is a good example of this concept that I've spoken about before is the game Hyperborea. And one of the downsides of the live streaming format is that I can't always prep a lot of pictures and things and insets to be displayed and like cut to video footage of stuff. So I'm not going to be able to show close-ups of lots of these games. I apologize. But I will paint you a very good picture in your imagination. I'll do my best to do that. Yeah. Okay, Hyperborea is a game that I think is a really good example to kick off this discussion. I've talked about this before, so I won't dwell on it too much. But Hyperborea is a game that I think doesn't set a lot of people's expectations correctly, because look at this cover here. You got, Mr. Adventurous Ranger here with drawing an arrow into his bow, going to hunt something down. You have your sorceress lady here who's ready to take on something, and other people who are also involved in this whole group, this clan, this party that's ready to go off on adventure. And if you saw this on the shelf, you're like, oh boy, I can't wait to go and make this adventure, make this group, and go out and kick some goblin butt. And the game itself is actually kind of just a worker placement Euro type game where you have a player board and place cubes on certain technologies you want to research, and you have a nice hexagonal random map where you place figures and units on to go explore there as well, and you manage your resources as you build more resources and play the game that way. Absolutely, when I played it, absolutely nothing like what we expected from the art on the box. But Hyperborea, the game itself, is actually a decent game. And but it's a good one to introduce the discussion because the box art, I think, really misleads some people. But the game that's in there, once you start playing the game itself, while it is a completely different game than what one might expect, I think is a solid game. A game that didn't quite do that for me, at least at first, is actually Small World. Hi, Small World. Let's fit you in there, little Small World box. Okay. So Small World is actually the game that started me off on this whole topic of discussion. I've had Small World in my collection, since for at least 7 years or so now. It was when I got back into hobby board gaming, Small World was one of the first games that I got. And wow, yeah, it was. So because I think, as I've mentioned, a lot of regular viewers know, I was raised on Risk. That Risk was the game that my family played all the time, and that was the primary board game that I had growing up. So, time goes by, you go to college, you move away, you get married, you find new friends, and you get together and you want to start a board game night. So Small World was one game that I had caught my eye at my local game shop. And it looked like area control, different units. It looked like Risk with a kind of a sense of humor and a fantasy theme to it. So I scooped up Small World and we brought it to the table. And then we played it. The first time I played Small World, probably about 7 years ago, was with a couple that we had over. And all four of us were expecting basically a Risk clone. And so we sat down to play it. And we played it, and by halfway through the game, all four of us had this confused look on our face. We didn't know what was going on with this game because it was nothing like what we had expected. We wanted it, we expected and wanted it to be a Risk clone, for better or worse. So we didn't appreciate Small World for what it was. And so we finished the game. We packed it up, I put it back on the shelf, and Small World sat on my shelf for probably 3 to 4 years unplayed because of that really weird first experience with it. And I'd take it out and dabble with it a little bit. But after that much time went by, getting back in more and more into the modern board game scene, knowing what to expect with it and knowing what else is out there, I eventually brought Small World back out off the shelf. And now that I knew what to expect and I knew all of the non-risk options that were available in board gaming, I played it again and it meshed a lot better. And so what I had to do with Small World is kind of the core idea of this episode is I had to stop projecting my own expectations for Small World onto it and appreciate the game for what it wanted to be. If I had reviewed Small World after that very first play 7 years or so ago, I would have probably ripped it apart. I would have said, this game doesn't know, it's weird. It doesn't do area control right. It made me sad and made my dog run away. And eventually my dog came back, which is good because if I was to review Small World today, I have a much richer appreciation of it. And I can leave my own personal bias of what I want the game to be out of the review. And I can just talk about Small World itself. Does Small World achieve what it wants to be? And I think Small World is an example of a board game that does achieve what it wants to be. And it does that really well. And in terms of modification or house ruling or anything like that, there's not really anything like that we do with Small World. Now that we know what to expect, we just play it as is. Of course, have all the expansions and stuff to have as many options as possible. But Small World has earned that right to be played the way it wants to be played. So there's Small World. So that's an example of one that we went into with a predetermined incorrect bias and had to let the game stand on its own. Similar game to that too. Since we're on the same topic, I'll show another one in that regard. The one that is still in the process of sitting and letting me get it acclimated until I get it back to the table again is the game Blank Cardboard Box Interior. The game Blue Moon Legends. Hi, Blue Moon Legends. Now, I talked about this on Board Game Breakfast about a year ago or so. Blue Moon Legends is another game that I think fits into the same bucket as Small World. Because Blue Moon Legends knows what it wants to be. And I believe what that is basically a sophisticated version of war, the card game War. That's really what this boils down to, in my opinion. And that's not a bad thing because it does it really well. It knows what it wants to be and it does that thing really well. But when I went into Blue Moon Legends, I was expecting Blue Moon Legends to be more like, Magic the Gathering meets Mage Wars type of thing like that. I was expecting the players to get heroes, almost like Warcraft 3 in a way, where you would get heroes and you would level them up and they would gain their own units and build little armies and other things to go and attack your enemy. And when we first played Blue Moon Legends, it was nothing like that. It was nothing at all like we expected. And so, again, totally threw me and the person I played it with for a loop. And I put it away for a while, but you'll notice that it's still in my collection. I haven't got it back to the table like I want to. I actually would like to really dig in to Blue Moon Legends, but it hasn't gotten to that point yet. It's just in the queue and it's been waiting. But the reason it's still in my collection instead of being tossed out is because even though it's not at all what I expected, and it left a bad taste in my mouth when I played, I believe that it is still a quality good game and just have to understand what game this wants to be. And stop trying to make it into a game that it's not. Now, I know a lot of people have talked about Blue Moon Legends, and I know there's a lot in here, so I'm hoping to eventually get back into this and really dig into a lot of what it has to offer. But that misconception can really throw you for a loop. And sometimes when you have that misconception about a game, a lot of people will say, okay, it's not for me, and they'll move on. But if you can get in that mindset of, okay, maybe that's just not what I wanted it to be, but maybe I can still appreciate this game for what it is. If you can get into that mindset, you might actually find some hidden gems that you otherwise might have passed on because they weren't what you expected. Whoosh. All right, so those are 2 examples of games, well, 3 examples actually. Those are 3 examples: Hyperborea, Blue Moon Legends, Small World. Games that for one reason or another, either through the way they were marketed or through prior baggage coming into it, were games that were totally different than what we expected, and we had to learn to put our own personal bias aside. Before I get to the next batch of games that kind of fit into this theme but have a little bit of a different approach, let's go over to the chat area to see what people are talking about and what people have to say about what we've discussed so far. And let's go in here. I moved my keyboard out of the way thinking I was going to drop box tops on it. So let me go in here and do a search in the comments and do a little chat time before we get back to looking at more of the games. Let's see here. Kabuki Kid, hello again, mentioned that Star Wars Rebellion was one of those bang, zing, zap games for her this year so far. Yep, it's not in my pile, but I did consider it. But yes, Star Wars Rebellion, I concur. For me, it was also one of those games that the first day I saw it online on BGG, and I saw what the game was about, I crossed my fingers and I said, please let Star Wars Rebellion be this type of game. And I had it in my mind. And when we sat down to play it, it was like, you said, bang, zoom, zing. Yep, this is exactly what I hoped it would be. And when a game pulls that off, it is fantastic. And that's actually a question I was considering asking and maybe even answering. The game, we're talking about games today that bang, zoom are exactly what you hoped they would be, and games that are like, dang it, if only this game had X in it. What percentage of games that you play are bang, zing, I wouldn't change a thing level games? I tried to quantify this for myself, and I had a lot of trouble. I waver from 80, depending what mood I'm in, I guess. This last week, while I've been thinking about it, I'll come through and I'll look at my collection, and I'll waver from 80% of the games I've played being, yeah, it was great, down to 20% of the games being, yeah, that was great, I wouldn't change anything. And that's a big discrepancy just from day to day. Just thinking, I really liked this game and I wouldn't change a thing. Then you come back to the same game, you're like, well, actually, maybe I would change some things. And you come back the day after that, well, no, it's okay. So I think this is a very subjective topic and can vary from day to day, same game, same person. But when you get one that hits it, you do know. All right. Kabuki Kid also mentioned, the original Lord of the Rings cooperative game is the one that I totally expected more from. It is set collection and hand management, but not as thematic as I expected. The Lord of the Rings cooperative game, I believe that's the precursor in a way, kind of an ancestor of Shadows over Camelot. Would you say then, since Shadows over Camelot is similar mechanism-wise, that it delivers better? Or would it also kind of miss the mark for you in the way that Lord of the Rings cooperative game did? I'm wondering if it's more a genre thing or just that particular game from the theme and the property that it was marketed on. Maybe that set your expectations differently. Joshua states, does theme play a big part in controlling our expectations for a game? If a game is mechanically weak but strong in theme, do we find that we still like it? Are we apt to house rule it? That's a good question. Last time, or time before last, in a recent metagame episode, I talked about my top 5 board game design elements, and theme was right up there near the top of my list, because I think that theme does play a very big part in controlling our expectations for a game. And yeah, I think a game that's mechanically weak, theme can help it survive. I think that mechanics and the rule set does override theme. So if you have a game that just stinks in gameplay, no theme is going to really save it 100% of the time. But I think that theme and mechanics can work side by side, pulling the game up the rungs a little bit together, benefiting each other. So yeah, I think that a game that's mechanically weak but still strong on theme, I think it still can be enjoyed. I think that it is maybe apt to be house ruled a little bit. I'm thinking of, I think a really good example of this is probably Betrayal at House on the Hill. There's a game that has some issues. Mechanisms-wise, components-wise even, and just the flow of the game sometimes. It can be sometimes really quick. Sometimes it can get away from you and just become this epic weird thing. But Betrayal at House on the Hill can tell such a good story that the people I play it with, actually my game group, it's one of the regular games that's played at my local game club. And the reason it's played so frequently is because the people enjoy the stories that it tells and the way they get to be sucked into those stories. And at the end of the day, after the game's put away and back on the shelf, the mechanisms, the components, and all of those are put aside, but what you have left is that story to tell. And so I think Betrayal at House on the Hill is one of those games where the theme and the story it tells is a prime example of one that lifts the game up better than it would be otherwise. Okay. Someone asks, is that an acceptable pronunciation of hexagonal or hexagonal? Because Tom says it the same way. I believe the correct pronunciation of that is actually ultra square, but no one I know pronounces or spells it that way. So we'll go with hexagonal or hexagonal. Ultra square, any way you want to say it, is cool with me. Joshua also mentions that he has a guilty love for fortune and glory. Oh, that was almost in addition to Betrayal at House on the Hill. That was the other game I was going to mention. He has a guilty love for fortune and glory that he's constantly house ruling because he understands it is objectively flawed, but still, he likes it so much. Yep, I totally agree with fortune and glory. Everything you just said about it. It's definitely one of those where the love for the game can lead to some small house ruling that is necessary to kind of streamline some of it, but totally worth it. Kabuki Kid mentions Quarriors is a game that I expected to really like, but it really didn't grab me. It is the reason I have yet to try Dice Masters still. Interesting. I'll tell you in my own personal experience, whether you want to know this or not, that I came this close to playing Quarriors, but I just couldn't do it. However, I did, kind of the flip side of your predicament, I did invest in Dice Masters because the way Dice Masters played, I liked a lot better. It matched what I wanted the Quarrior system to be. So since Dice Masters matched what I wanted that game to be better, I invested in Dice Masters over Quarriors. And I think I'm glad I did because I played the Lord of the Rings dice building game. At least I tried to. And just talking about that game made me throw up a little bit in my mouth. That Lord of the Rings dice building game is very similar, much more similar to Quarriors than the Marvel Dice Masters. And it was a hot mess. So I can see where you're coming from there. One more note here, then we'll pop back to the next games on my list. Joshua also asks, do the official versions of Risk, Lord of the Rings Risk, Risk Legacy, etc., that have changed what you learned, do the official versions of Risk that have changed what you learned or have fond memories of from childhood cloud your impressions of those games? No, but I do own almost many of the many of the versions of Risk, including the Lord of the Rings Risk. When actually that same couple that we played Small World with, soon after that we got Lord of the Rings Risk, and we played that together. And that was still close enough to our expectations of what we thought Small World would be, but put a neat twist on it with the Lord of the Rings theming and mechanisms. That one got a pass from everybody. We played that. Wow, we played that for at least a year on a regular, bi-weekly basis. And Risk Legacy, which, spoiler alert, Risk Legacy will be on my top 100 games of all time list. And I won't spoil the reason why here, but Risk Legacy to me also stands on its own and has its own fond memories, which wasn't ruined or tarnished by any previous experience growing up with Risk. But Risk Legacy has its own special reasons for standing on its own. And I think even if Risk Legacy was not actually even a Risk game, was even slightly different, I think it would still stand on its own, even if it wasn't the Risk license. Okay, let's move on to the next subset of games that I have here. And these are games where the mechanisms are okay, but tend more towards house ruling or using almost as a sandbox for other versions of play. For example, let me start with one where the company did it themselves. First example of this is, I think, the Marvel Legendary deck building game, which the concept of this game is that you will have a set of at least a half dozen or so hero decks that you start off with being able to shuffle up, and you pick, you have 5 available to purchase at a time, and you'll have to accumulate some money and stuff to buy these people to add them to your deck. And so as you purchase bigger and better heroes, they cycle into your deck, and your deck becomes bigger and better. And at the same time, villains are trickling into various places in the city, and you have to battle them before they get away or pull off their own plot that they're trying to accomplish. So the Marvel Legendary deck building game is to me one that I think is, personally for me, is 90% of the way there. 90% of the way to what I would want it to be. And I think that it's that way for a lot of people. And the reason why is I look at the comparison to another game that's built on the same core engine, but that is the the Aliens version of this, based on the Aliens movie franchise. The Aliens game takes this, but adds missions and some extra options. And also, when the villains of that game come out, instead of just coming out into various parts of the city, the villains enter play kind of face down. You don't know what you're dealing with until you go and encounter it. You know something's happening there, but not until you go and encounter it do you really know what you're in for. And the missions and the other little twists, and that twist of putting the cards face down, those things, to me, I like the Marvel theme better than the Aliens theme, even though I think in the case of the Aliens Legendary game, I think it fits really well for the gameplay. But if they could incorporate those types of mechanisms into the Marvel Legendary, bang zoom, I think Marvel Legendary would like hit 99.9% of that sweet spot. And so this is one where I myself have kind of tinkered with trying to house rule it to incorporate those ideas into it. But I would like to see an official, maybe some of the most recent expansions like the Civil War or the Secret Wars. I don't have the second Secret Wars or the Civil War expansions yet. But maybe the most recent expansions incorporate those ideas. But I doubt it because I haven't seen anything specifically stating that. But I would love it if Upper Deck... Is this? Yes, Upper Deck. I would love it if Upper Deck was to take some of those ideas from the Aliens Legendary game and incorporate that into this to add a little more mystery and those subtle little nuances to this game. That would be fantastic. So to me, this game is one that's 90% there, but just I think needs a little bit more push. A game along the same lines that is even more extreme, I'd say maybe 60% of the way to what I wanted it to be, is the Lord of the Rings deck building game. This is Cryptozoic, built on, I believe, what is called the Cerebus deck building engine. There's also the DC deck building game, but I chose to invest in the Lord of the Rings version of it. So this game, now one thing that subtly also bothers me about Marvel Legendary, but isn't as bad, but bothers me more in Lord of the Rings, is that there's only, when you are buying cards in Lord of the Rings, again, similar concept, you start with a basic deck, you have cards available that you can purchase to put into your, to kind of shuffle into your deck that make it bigger and more powerful, and then you also have objectives and villains that you're trying to accomplish and beat. But the thing that really bothers me about the Cerebus engine and Lord of the Rings is that there is, to do all of those things, there is only one currency. And at least Marvel Legendary has two currencies. A currency to purchase heroes, and then a second currency to fight villains. But it's always bugged me that Cerebus engine only has just the one currency. And so you're doing everything with that. And then the other thing, too, is I just think that the gameplay, a lot of people have complained about, with Lord of the Rings, is a lot more cooperative, but you'll have things that one player will do that will, well, flip a card and it can hurt other players. And it's not very, doesn't make you feel like you're on a cooperative quest. So this game, I wanted to mention because, like I said, where Marvel Legendary is maybe 90% of the way there towards what I want it to be, Lord of the Rings deck building game is still a game I enjoy, but it's probably only 60% of the way there towards what I want it to be. And when you hit that threshold, an interesting thing happens, at least in my collection. The Lord of the Rings game, I'll bring out and I'll play every now and then, just solo mostly, but I will barely ever anymore play it by the actual game rules. And I will use it as a sandbox to come up with ideas and experiment with different ways of playing this game, almost different versions of solitaire almost. And I thought of actually creating a series of videos of, just like gameplay variations for this game and some others where myself and some friends have created not necessarily house rules, but maybe variations on how to play or different ideas on how to do it. But Lord of the Rings is one where the game certainly is not what I wanted it to be. And I'm not exactly sure 100% with this one, if it really, I think the game wants to be I think the game is what it wants to be, what its designers wanted it to be. But what they wanted it to be is a little less potent, a little less bite to it, a little less adventurous than what I was hoping for. So the Lord of the Rings, I still enjoy, and I still bring it out, but I usually use it. That causes it to be used more as a sandbox game to come up with other ideas and variations of the game. Now, with that thought in mind, that brings us to the piece de resistance of this idea. I think the game that you not only have to go in with an idea of it being a sandbox mode type game and creating variations and experimenting with it, a game that not only that's the way you go into it, but the designers themselves went into it with that idea, is 504 by Stronghold Games and Friedman Fries. Now this game is, I think I've mentioned before and others have mentioned it, this is an experiment where there are 7 to 9 different modules. And when you play it, you pick 3. And not only the modules you pick, but the order that you pick them in to apply them to your gameplay session will change the components you play with and the rules of the game itself. And so there are up to 504 different possible combinations of games. There's 504 games in this box, or wherever the actual box is. There's 504 potential different games with different rules and different win conditions in this box. So that's the very definition of a sandbox environment of the game. Now, so this is a game that not only had that applied to it, but embraced that idea. Now, that obviously is what this game wants to be. And I think that 504 pulls that off spectacularly. The main complaint I've heard about 504 is that instead of having one really powerful, good game, you're left with 504, that was okay games. And when people are asked the question of, well, that you just played game number 286. If 286 was its own standalone game, would you have gone and bought that game from a game shop? Well, and then usually the response is, no, it's not that strong of a game that I would go and buy it because I want to play that one over again. The lure of 504 is much more, I think, as an experiment in game design. And I think that is what this game wants to be. And I'm wondering, too, one of the reasons I wanted to mention this in today's show is I'm wondering if, since 504 wants to be this sandboxy, experimental kind of tool set, have any people out there actually created a 505th or 506th or other variations? Have people actually taken the core concepts in 504 and even taken it a step further and created their own games based on this engine that are even different and new than the 504 that you could play in the box? Has anyone created number 505 based on their own rules and their own ideas and mechanisms? So that's what I want to know, because 504, I think, is a game that not only needs that, but encourages that whole sandbox approach. So kind of the extreme other end in thought. What this game wants to be is, I think, what a lot of people expected it to be. But I think what this game wanted to be was not necessarily the best game out there, but it wanted to be something that was an experiment and something to just tinker with more than fall in love with. So that's 504. And one I'm definitely keeping in my collection because I think that 504 definitely achieves what it wants itself to be. And it's just very different and very interesting on what it wants to be. Okay, I got one more little pile of games over here. But before we get to that pile of games, let's go back to the chat area. And yep, my YouTube chat jumped a lot. Sorry. So let's kind of scroll upwards in the chat a little bit and see if we can get people on this portion of the topic, whether on this part of the topic or not. And let's start with Round to It. Oh, good. I'm glad I got to you. Round to It says, sometimes a game is as amazing as I thought it would be, but it's difficult to get enough people together that are willing to play it, let alone fall in love with it. Codenames and Space Cadets for me. Yes, that's really one of the double-edged swords with board gaming, isn't it? Is that since it is a social activity that involves other people, the trick is being able to find enough other people that are interested in playing the game that you want to play in order to get it played. If someone could come up with the solution to that problem, they would become a hero of the industry. And sentient robots, we've already discussed, are not the solution. So keep looking. But I agree with you there. Let's see here. What's next? Here's someone talking about Zaya. Oh, Kabuki Kid, hello. A commonly accepted house rule for Zaya is to roll 2 dice when moving and using the higher result to help mitigate the issue of people being stuck with low rolls too often. Makes it more fun. That is an excellent house rule. Zaya, I almost pulled off my shelf to discuss today. I love Zaya. And the biggest problem that my group and I have encountered with Zaya is the massive amount of downtime between turns. We've played a 5-player game, and I have literally had almost 20 to 40 minutes between turns. I know that I was hosting, so it got to the point where we were playing in between turns. I went and made myself like my lunch, made it and ate it and cleaned it up between my turns without anyone waiting for me. Then also started cleaning the house between turns. And again, no one, didn't disrupt the game at all. So what we've tried, we haven't tried, what I've wanted to do with Zaya is to actually have, if you have 4 or 5 players, have the 2 people across the table taking their turns simultaneously, if possible. And have one person who has priority in case there's a conflict or they have to interact. But then have the 2 players taking their turns simultaneously and have those turns going around the table. I wanted to try that and see if that mitigates the problem we've had of massive downtime between turns. And if anyone else has tried that with Zaya or any other game, let me know, because that is something I have wanted to try, and if it works, advocate, but I haven't got around to it because every time I bring it up, everyone looks at me funny than usual. All right. Noonie Kurt says, "Hi, Chaz." Hi. Some games contain good alternative rules. That's true. Some games do have variants of play right in the rulebook. For example, my wife and me play the peaceful variant of Imperial Settlers, since we don't like to attack each other. That's a really good point. Lots of games, the game designers themselves will include variants of the games. And that might make an interesting series in and of itself. Someone to go through and compare for games that actually in the rulebook contain variations, compare the quality of play of the variations included within the rules by the designers themselves to see if all of those variations are as strong as one another, or if they're just tacked on afterthoughts that are like, you'd never want to play it that way. I think we might be surprised. That might be something for someone that has a video camera and a lot of spare time on their hands to do. All right. Jesse mentions Naratu DBG is the superior version of the Cerebus engine games. So the Naratu deck building game is the superior version. I have not played that one, but I will take a look for it. Because I know that with the Cerebus engine, they're just vomiting out as many different licenses and properties with it as possible. So I'll check that out. I'm wondering, off the top of your head, does the Naratu deck building game, does it change, add, alter anything with the core Cerebus engine? Or is it just another skinning of it? I want to know. C. Bruce mentions Marvel Legendary plays like a comic book. The bad guys enjoy success early, but slowly you are able to overcome them. I totally agree. That's one of the things I think is really interesting about the Marvel deck building game. You definitely take a pounding at the beginning, and if you can exponentially ramp your power up, you have this period of struggle, and then at the end, poof. You almost have a landslide sometimes. And some of the people I've played it with said, well, the ending wasn't a challenge enough. So I'm wondering if an Aliens variant, where you are flipping the cards over or something like that, if that might actually mitigate that exponential landslide at the end. Again, I want to know. Oh, continuing on, C. Bruce continues with the Marvel Marginal Legendary game. I like it better than DC's, even though the mechanics of the card play make more sense logically with the theme in the DC version over the Marvel version. I could see it both ways. I know there's certain people that have very strong opinions about how thematic the DC deck building game with the Cerebus engine is. That again, they have very strong opinions. So I'm going to plead the fifth for my own opinion so that I don't end up getting into a 2-hour-long opinionated discussion on which one is superior and why. But thank you for your comments. Oh, there's one more additional. See, Bruce, even, you know what, I should look ahead in the comments one of these days. See, Bruce finishes his thoughts with, i.e., you have one hero using moves in DC, whereas you randomly do or do not have heroes' powers in Marvel. Okay, that's fine. Scott, from some place that I recognize, mentions, I think it's Cerberus, not Cerebus. You're probably right, and I'm probably wrong. I do know this. I've heard Cerebus called Cerebus, Cerberus, Cerebus, Ultra Square. I've heard it referred to as so many. Everyone pronounces it different. So I think for safety's sake, we'll just say that sure, we'll pronounce it the way you think is right. So can't go wrong with that approach. Okay, Alex mentions, what's your least/favorite game where a variant has become the standard played version? Oh, fantastic question. Oh, and that is unfortunately one I would have to think about because I want to do that question justice. I'm looking across my room at my game shelves to see if there's any that pop out to me off the top of my head. Oh, such a good question. I'm going to come back to that question either in this episode or a future one. That might even be a good topic. But again, that question was, what is your least/favorite game where a variant has become the standard played version? Yeah, I want to do that one justice. So let me think on that one. And the comments just jumped. I apologize. So I'll look for one more good question here. And then we'll pop back. Let's see, Marvel Legendary, like a comic book. Okay, speaking of 504, 504 seems like those Chinese Nintendo cartridges that had 60 bootlegged games on one cartridge. And most were okay, but none were really any that you'd want to buy on its own. I can totally see what you're talking about there. And yeah, but I did love Super Marler Brothers. That was one of my favorite of those bootlegged games. So, okay, let's continue on with the final chapter in today's discussion. Games that I think nailed it. Even if they aren't our favorite games that we still can appreciate and say, yeah, that's exactly what it wanted to be. And so I have two examples with me right here of this. I actually grabbed more boxes than I had time to go over, so I'll put those aside. One game, this is a game that I talked about recently, talked about in great detail actually in a video, but so it's still on my mind fresh, but I think it's a really good example of that, is The Golden Ages by Stronghold Games. And I just recently did a video on this one, and I think this is a prime example of this concept. Because The Golden Ages, to many people, is marketed as a Civ building game. But The Golden Ages doesn't want to be a Civ building game. As much as you want it to be, it wants to be a worker placement, resource allocation, Euro style game. And it does that really well with a slight Civ, well, more than slight, but with a Civ building theme. But Sid Meier's Civilization, Clash of Cultures, this is not. And so when I went into this game to play it and evaluate it, I went in with more of that Civ building mindset. And it was really discombobulating at first. It took me a couple rounds to go, oh, this is what this game wants to be. It's like, oh, okay, this was such an interesting surprise. This is worth talking about. And so this is a game where, again, it's not a game that I would naturally be drawn to as much. I would be drawn more to the Sid Meier's Civilizations and the Clash of Cultures. But I can appreciate what this game wanted to be, because what it wants to be, it does. And I thought that was a really interesting, pleasant surprise with it, but one that threw a lot of people off. And I think, like with Hyperborea, which is now buried under other boxes, as with Hyperborea, that misconception of what the game is about has actually thrown it off a lot of people's radar, which is a shame. So there's that one. Another game that I think nailed it, and forgive me, because I don't know if a lot of people will agree with this one or not, but I'm the one with a camera pointed at me, so bear with me. Another game that I think nailed it is Star Wars Risk. And you might be like, what? But bear with me a second. Because Star Wars Risk is actually based on the Queen's Gambit. So this is a game that's based on, I would say, is like the child of or grandchild of, in a way, a descendant of another game. So the Queen's Gambit is a game that already exists and it already has its own mechanisms. And the Queen's Gambit stands very strongly on what it wants to be. So since this is a different game, and it's not the exact same as Queen's Gambit, couldn't you say that, well, this game wants to be Queen's Gambit, but it's not. So isn't that a failure? Well, I don't think so. Because with Star Wars Risk, I think what it didn't want to replicate Queen's Gambit. It wanted to be an accessible game that got that game back in the marketplace that was more accessible to more people while retaining those ideas and still being engaging. And so in that respect, I think it really, really succeeded. It has the Risk branding on there, and it's barely a Risk game. So in that respect, does it want to be a Risk game? And again, I'm going to give Star Wars Risk, the benefit of the doubt, because I'm going to say that what this game actually wanted to be is what it turned out to be, and what in its design environment, what it could become. It became the best of what it had the potential to become. And I think that little Risk branding there is just to get this game pulled off game shelves. Because without that right there, you still have the Star Wars logo on there. But what these days doesn't have the Star Wars logo on it. But without that Risk logo on there, see, that set people's expectations in a way of what to expect. So in a way, it twisted people's expectations. So maybe I am coloring it a little bit. Maybe I am bringing my own baggage because I was familiar with the Queen's Gambit and I did research this game beforehand. So I knew it was going to be a variation of Queen's Gambit. If I was coming in cold off the street, I would probably be surprised at how this game plays. However, I think I would be very, very pleasantly surprised. This isn't like Lord of the Rings Risk or Metal Gear Risk or Sesame Street Risk or all the other just IPs that they've painted on with watercolors onto Risk and vomited that out in the marketplace. This was actually a new idea that put a twist on that. So yeah, maybe I am biased and a hypocrite for liking that to the point where I would put it in this category of games that maybe didn't meet your expectations, but I think nailed what it wanted to be. But I stand by that opinion, unless anyone can convince me otherwise. So there's an example of two games that I think nailed what they wanted to be. And of course, there's many, many, many others, but those are the only two that I had time to grab off my shelf before we started streaming. So do you have games that you think nailed it? Which are the ones that you think are perfecto? They got it absolutely right. We've talked about Star Wars Rebellion as well. So let's turn over to the comments with our last few minutes and see. I'm going to scroll downwards and try to see what other people have listed as their game that is absolutely nails it. Let's make the things highlight. And let's go down here. Let's see here. Okay, well, most recent comments here since we started that portion of the discussion. Gustavo says, what would hurt the game more, the Risk branding or the prequels branding? Oh, I think we know the answer to that one. Let's just say that I think a lot of people are happy that they chose the versions of the Star Wars movies that they did to apply to this game. Rather than the prequels. So, good question. William says, is there a realistic difference of an opinion on a dislike of a game compared to a game that is bad because it just does not work. How would you separate the two? I hope that makes sense. Opinion on a dislike of a game compared to a game that is bad just because it does not work. Well, I may have one right here. Actually, one of the games that I was pulled off my shelf that I didn't think I was going to get to is actually Artifacts Inc. by Red Raven Games. This is designed by Ryan Lucat? Yeah, Ryan Lucat, who, my personal opinion, I think is brilliant. He is a true Renaissance man. He does the design, the artwork, the publishing, and everything. I don't know how he does it, and I don't know how he does it so consistently well. But Artifacts Inc. is one of those games that with everyone I've played it with, after we played it, was like, because this game, I think, just doesn't fire on all cylinders. So to go back to Gustav's question, is there a realistic difference of an opinion on a dislike of a game compared to a game that is bad because it just does not work? Artifacts Inc., I think there is a good game in here. I just think it was not fully baked. I think that this is a game that just didn't work with the mechanisms that it came with in the rulebook. Actually, it's been almost one of the pet projects of a couple of people in my game club, is trying to come up with a variant of house rules that makes this a well-oiled machine that people want to play in our game club. And so it's been like an interesting discussion and some experimentation. But so I think this is an example of what you were talking about there. A game that is still a good game in here, but so it's not a bad game, but the mechanisms just didn't work, which was keeping it down. And then, so for that reason of why people weren't playing it. So hopefully that's an example of a game that fits that criteria. Thank you. That was William's question. Let's see here. Let's see if I can make these highlight one more time. We'll go back to the comments. Here we go. Satya mentions one of the games that nailed it for me was the X-Wing miniatures game. But just because it is a great game doesn't mean it hits the table as often as it should. That's a very good point. It's always fun to play your favorite games, and a game that nails it. Something for us to consider offline, maybe in a future discussion, is I am an aficionado of music too. I have a large collection of music. But one thing that I will do is, especially if it's a song that I really like and it comes up in my random rotation, I'll skip it if I feel I haven't earned listening to it. I'm not in a good enough mood, or it just doesn't feel right. Also, I have a rule with myself that I will only listen to any given song only one time per day. Even if it's a new album and a song I love, one play per day max. I wonder if anyone out there institutes this policy with their favorite board games, the games that nail it. Are there games that you purposefully throttle yourself back on playing because you don't want to ruin it for yourself? You don't want to get bored of it and sick of it, so you actually will purposely keep yourself from playing it? And if so, is that a wise thing for us to do? Should we just play a game? Should we play our favorite games until they're not anymore? And that may be a whole nother topic of discussion. So maybe we'll come back to that in a future episode or something. But excellent food for thought there. And 2 more questions here, and then we'll wrap up. Kabuki Kid mentions, the regular version of Risk Star Wars also has Kylo Ren on the cover. Which is a joke because the game is about Return of the Jedi when Kylo Ren wasn't even born yet. Now that you mentioned it, I think I've seen that. I've never actually comprehended that. I think you're right. Thanks, marketing. Good job. Way to sell games. Okay, and we'll wrap up with this statement from Joshua, who says, I think Viticulture, the Essential Edition, nails it. The mechanics work well with the theme. I spend a lot of time in wine country. Maybe that's coloring my own opinion. Oh no, he says. I have heard a lot of good things about viticulture. And a friend of mine, one of the people that got a shout out at the beginning of the show, has the deluxe extra expanded edition. It's like this tall. It's like 3 boxes in one in this big ultra box. And consistently asks, do you want to play this at our next game club meeting? And I unfortunately have yet to be able to sit down and play Viticulture with all the goodies. But wow, I've heard that from so many people that Viticulture nails it. Hopefully I'll get a chance to play it, and hopefully I will agree when I get it too. And hopefully all of you guys will be able to find a new game that nails it for you and you can enjoy playing and even let yourself play more than once a day. But until then, we're going to have to wrap up this episode. And I'm going to go get some food put into me. But until the next time that we meet, thank you so much to the comments section for joining me on this episode of The Metagame. I look forward to our next conversation. And until then, take care, and I'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks so much for watching the Dice Tower videos. Find more great videos and reviews, as well as our top-rated audio podcast at Dicetower.com. You can also find other great shows at Dicetowernetwork.com. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching The Dice Tower. The Dice Tower is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc., where you can find great games for great prices. Cool stuff in stock. Check them out at CoolStuffInc.com.